Story 1. Bad faith and deception by one group. To begin with, the decision wasn't for Democrats or Republicans. It was against the Trump administration, which was instructed to follow a judge's order. The Trump administration has repeatedly misled the courts and the public regarding reality and their actions. They will assert that Garcia was wrongfully detained and that they are trying to comply with the law, claiming their hands are tied, while simultaneously boasting on social media that he is a gang member and criminal who deserves to be there, insisting that judges have no authority over them. Judge Boasberg's legal opinion details how he is being openly deceived, and Trump is dismissing attorneys when they present the truth. Trump frequently admits to wrongdoing, then denies it, claiming he never said such things and calling it fake news. He admits again, boasting that no one can stop him, and then denies it once more, asserting that anyone discussing it is a hater or loser. This pattern has persisted for decades. His followers are entirely complicit in this and show no interest in seeking the truth or reconciling his lies. Story 2. Because if Republicans acknowledge that the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against Trump, and that Trump is ignoring that ruling, it would mean Democrats have been right about him this entire time. So, obviously, the Supreme Court must have ruled in his favor. Story 3. I would like to think it is because it was 9-0 in favor of the Constitution, but it does not seem like that is something Republicans care about any longer. Story 4. Trump learned from Joseph McCarthy's lawyer Roy Cohn, who advised to distort the facts as much as possible and for as long as possible, and then people will believe it. That's why Trump constantly claims that the 2020 election was rigged and that he won by a huge margin, despite knowing neither statement is true. By continuing to lie, it becomes accepted as the truth. Trump's followers mimic this behavior and don't even bother to seek out what the actual truth is. It's irrelevant to them. Story 5. No one reads the actual court opinion. They rely on their preferred media for interpretation, often only skimming the headlines. The opinion stated that the executive must facilitate his return to the United States, but suggesting they effectuate his return might overstep, as the executive branch is responsible for foreign policy. The opinion requested that the judge clarify her demand. One side interprets facilitate his return as meaning to bring him home, while the other hears they don't have to effectuate his return. It is a nuanced opinion issued by the Supreme Court, paying closer attention to the semantic and legal meanings of key terms than the average American does when engaging with news. That's my perspective. Story 6. Stephen Miller and Donald Trump make statements, and the right-wing media that broadcasts their claims does not challenge them. As a result, these statements are accepted as facts. Story 7. Stephen Miller is dishonestly relying on a few misinterpreted technicalities to support his claim. Anyone who believes him is either a true believer or blindly misled. Stephen Miller is aware of this. He is malevolent, not foolish. Donald Trump may or may not be aware, and he certainly does not care. As for Trump supporters, it varies, but most, I suspect, are accepting his word in good faith, which is unfortunately becoming the kind of unwavering faith that leads followers to disastrous outcomes. Story 8. We do not believe that. It is just the government telling lies again. At this point, it is not necessarily about Garcia that much. He is a figure that we can rally around. It is about the president ignoring the courts, the Constitution, and being stripped of our rights. Story 9. If Donald Trump claimed that he invented electricity, his followers would repeat it, and members of his administration would confirm it before Congress. Story 10. The ruling gave the administration just enough flexibility to falsely claim that they do not actually have to take any action. Of course, they are incorrect, and the Supreme Court indicated as much by ordering the district court to clarify the precise meaning of effectuate, rather than removing it entirely, but there is room for confusion there. Beyond the text of the specific ruling in this case, there is ample precedent for courts to issue orders that impact foreign policy to some degree. For example, there was a time when banks were ordered, despite the president's strong objections, to hand over Venezuela's funds to a bondholder who sued after Venezuela had negotiated extended terms with all its other creditors, forcing the country to default because billions of dollars were withdrawn from their bank accounts. Then there was a situation in which a U.S. court ordered that gold, which had been entrusted to the United Kingdom by Poland at the beginning of World War II and subsequently shipped to the United States as the United Kingdom's property, be returned to Poland. That order required a U.S. executive agency to take active steps to transfer the gold, regardless of any objections from the United Kingdom. The point is that those who claim that courts cannot compel the president or subordinate executive branch officials to take active measures in compliance with an order are mistaken. There are limits to what can be required, but something like stop providing them money would clearly fall within a court's authority, even if bomb them until they comply would not. Denying otherwise is a misguided viewpoint that relies on the belief that the law is merely a set of magical phrases subject to that one weird trick that can extricate an individual from any situation. It does not work that way. The only strange tactic is unconstitutionally disregarding orders and daring anyone to take action against it while hoping that they do not. This is not a valid legal argument. It is simply a blatant power grab. Indeed, it is no different from the behavior of criminals. Story 11. Everyone involved in this knows that, apart from a minor quibble about wording, the Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration. Trump knows it, Vance knows it, and even Stephen Miller knows it. However, they also know that neither the Supreme Court nor the District Court has any real, practical way to enforce the ruling now that the Department of Justice is no longer pretending to be apolitical. If it comes down to complete overt defiance, it effectively breaks the American legal system. The Supreme Court would be shown to be completely powerless, which has consequences, even for Trump. If the laws aren't valid and the Constitution doesn't matter, then he loses legitimacy as an elected leader, and we don't know what happens at that point. Widespread unrest, civil war, secession of blue states, military dictatorship. Who knows? It's not a situation that any leader would be able to reliably control. I don't think they actually want that. I believe they are trying to either provoke the district judge into overstepping her authority in a way they can leverage to get the whole thing thrown out, or to return to the Supreme Court and pressure them into creating some kind of face-saving solution for the good of the Republic. We are waiting to see who blinks first. Anyone who was bullied as a child or who has been in an abusive relationship will recognize the techniques being used. It's nothing particularly new or especially strategic. Story 12. The Democrats believe the ruling illustrates that we are still under some semblance of the rule of law, that checks are balancing, and that the ruling is a sign there isn't a real government coup. The Republicans believe whatever they need for cognitive dissonance to resolve since they cannot accept being wrong under any circumstance, and thus latch onto the wording of the ruling to claim there is a hidden issue where the court found a way to deceive the Democrats. Both are wrong, but for different reasons. Either way, the United States is under siege by a group that has taken over one of the major political parties, dismantled the government and its systems, and installed a dictator to facilitate the theft of all wealth in service of the richest individuals on the planet. Story 13. Trump's deceased friend had a strategy that stated to declare victory regardless of loss or absurdity. Trump declared a 9-0 in his favor. Story 14. It is this part that makes it ambiguous as to what level of authority the court has over Trump's administration. The intended scope of the term effectuate in the district court's order is unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. The district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. It is definitely not a 9-0 straight win for the government, but it does not provide crystal clarity. Story 15. Republicans are aware it is not in their favor. Do not assume good faith in anything the Republicans say, or you will struggle to understand what is happening in this country and will find yourself constantly confused. Story 16. I don't know if it's already happening, but you need to ridicule these individuals. Instead of getting mad, just smile and laugh in their faces about how foolish they are. That hurts them more than a debate because you can't debate with foolish people. Story 17. The Democrats believe they won because they are required to bring him back. The Republicans think they won because they embrace alternative facts and hope to cover up their embarrassment. Story 18. It is the Republicans doing what they have done since 2020, which is blatantly lying about objective reality and truth. They behave like a cult. Story 19. The Supreme Court ruled in a limited manner in favor of Trump, stating that a local court cannot conduct foreign policy by compelling the president to make a deal with a foreign nation. In every other aspect, they ruled against the administration, determining that all of its actions were blatantly illegal. Essentially, conservatives are misrepresenting the situation. The ruling indicates that the president cannot be forced to negotiate a deal with another nation by a lower court, which is being used to disregard the fact that every action taken was illegal. While nobody can compel them to rectify the situation, it was not legal to proceed in that manner. The courts cannot compel Trump to have El Salvador return him, but they can advise, do not do that again. Story 20, because, contrary to what most of the comments say, it is actually a really vague order to the point of being useless. Honestly, if anything, I struggle to read it as anything but a significant win for the Trump administration. I do not understand where we get off saying it is a 9-0 decision. Someone needs to show me some evidence of that. My understanding is that it was an unsigned decision with no publicly registered dissents. However, with emergency docket cases that remain unsigned, we never really know. The liberal wing also put out a statement indicating they had some concerns, even if they largely agreed. So, 9-0? I am not convinced it is that simple. While it is true that the Supreme Court of the United States agreed with the lower court that the federal government should facilitate the return of a man improperly deported, which is a win for non-Trump supporters, they also sent the decision back to the lower court to further clarify the term effectuate, used in the lower court ruling. But they do not just leave it at that. They go on to say this is because of the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. So why is this a win for Trump? As other articles and commenters have pointed out, facilitate, while ensuring deference to the executive branch to conduct foreign policy, means practically speaking that this individual can be treated like any other foreign national since he is not an American citizen held captive by a foreign power. The administration needs to come up with a plan to negotiate and fly them home if they are released. But that means that the administration has already met half that requirement by saying to the president of El Salvador, "Hey, can you release him so we can bring him home?" To which that individual said, "No, now all the Trump administration has to do to be in compliance is say," which they have, "We have a plane ready to go for when they release him, and we have done all we can to talk them into it. But the ball is in their court now. Since we get to set the foreign policy agenda, you cannot tell us to do more than that in our conversation with El Salvador." Meanwhile, the Supreme Court of the United States could have said something like, "Since you are paying El Salvador to imprison immigrants you send them, he is still effectively in U.S. custody. Therefore, it is not foreign but domestic policy, so get that poor soul back here like the appeals court told you to," but they chose not to. Now the floodgates are open. All Trump has to do is get anyone over the border and into custody of anyone who is not literally a U.S. federal employee and point to this decision to say, "Sorry, we have a plane ready to bring them home whenever their captor wants to release them. We have facilitated all we can," and poof, that person is gone for good. But it is somewhat of a win for non-Trump supporters because they did not just throw out everything. Story 21. Republican officials are not being truthful. However, the statements are so absurd that no one is expected to believe them. They serve as a loyalty test intended to demonstrate how morally compromised their followers are willing to be, making them complicit. Those who choose to perpetuate the falsehoods are aware that they are falsehoods. Story 22. The Republicans have been framing this as a question of whether a United States federal judge has jurisdiction over the government of El Salvador. This is misleading at best. Although the original order could have been worded more clearly to avoid malicious misinterpretation that the administration could have reasonably foreseen, no reasonable person was under any illusion that the ruling was anything but a directive to the executive branch to correct its admitted error. The Supreme Court ruling affirmed that understanding, which is how the Democrats declare victory. The Supreme Court had the opportunity to act in a blatantly oppressive manner in this ruling and unanimously declined to do so. To the Republicans, the ruling can be manipulated to align with their argument that American judges do not have jurisdiction in El Salvador, allowing them to publicly frame it as a victory, even though that was never the issue. It is also a de facto victory since the ruling places the responsibility for taking corrective action on the executive branch under its diplomatic authority. They are simply not going to do it, making a point about the lack of an effective mechanism to compel them. On one hand, It would be a bad precedent to allow the judicial branch to micromanage diplomatic strategy. On the other hand, there is no clear legal standard to distinguish good from bad faith in implementing the order. I asked, he said no is technically compliance, however malicious. Out of an abundance of fairness, one could imagine a situation in which the United States, acting in good faith, extradites a foreign criminal suspect and then realizes afterward that there was a reason the extradition should not have proceeded. There would be legitimate tension between a reasonable expectation that the government would make every reasonable effort to rectify its error and an equally reasonable expectation that the United States will respect the sovereignty of foreign nations that would be reluctant to release their suspect due to procedural mistakes in the United States. That's not what is happening here, of course, but the situation is similar enough to create complex legal problems. Ultimately, the constitutional assumption is that an unlawful president will be impeached and removed. In the absence of that possibility, any court order requiring specific action from the executive branch is effectively void, making any victory in the sense of we're going to keep doing whatever we please and you can't stop us a victory. Story 23. Is any ruling really against Trump when he can just ignore them with no consequences? This is the part that terrifies me. We are learning just how far democracy can fall when corruption is in control. The checks and balances do not work when the other branches that are supposed to provide that balance are also corrupt. This is how freedom dies. Story 24. There is no single reality anymore. People live in their worldview silos and consider anything the other side says a lie if it conflicts with their perspective. Anything can be spun, even if it seems unreasonable, because people want reinforcement of their beliefs, not actual reality. It does not matter how weak the argument or evidence for a position is. If someone wants to believe in a particular worldview, they will cling to the weakest rationale to maintain it. Story 25. Because the ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States is carefully worded. The Supreme Court stated that the administration needs to facilitate the return of Mr. Garcia. The lower courts indicated that the administration needs to facilitate and effectuate the return. Essentially, the lower court said, you need to take steps to make this a possibility and make a concerted effort to make it happen. The Supreme Court's ruling is essentially, you need to take steps to make this a possibility, but they stopped short of ordering that the second part of the lower court's ruling be enforced. In summary, words have meaning, and different words convey different meanings. Both sides fail to recognize this, leading them to mistakenly believe that the ruling is a victory for them. Democrats think that facilitate means the Trump administration must bring him back, while Republicans correctly believe that facilitate merely implies that the administration needs to ask nicely. If the other country refuses, they can wash their hands of the situation and say, well, we tried. Amid these developments, the vast majority of U.S. citizens are realizing that the Supreme Court does not have significant enforcement power. Their authority depends on public compliance with their rulings. As President Jackson suggested in the aftermath of Worcester versus Georgia, paraphrased, the Supreme Court has made its decision. Now let them enforce it. Story 26. The opinion stated that the judge cannot force the administration to take action, but they can compel the administration to make every effort within their power to do so. One side views the first half as a victory. The Supreme Court said you cannot force us. While the other side sees it as a victory, the Supreme Court says you must try. Story 27. As an independent, I think it was the best ruling they could realistically have made. They ordered the lower court judge to clarify her ruling, which in itself prevented the Supreme Court from being more decisive. Here's why. The lower court judge ordered the government to facilitate the return of Mr. Garcia. However, she did not define that term, leaving it open to interpretation. The government argues that facilitating means removing domestic obstacles to Mr. Garcia's return. In other words, the government does not have to take any active steps to make it happen. They just have to allow it. The judge made this interpretation possible by not providing clear and specific instructions in the order. She should have required the government to take specific actions to bring about Mr. Garcia's return, but, for whatever reason, chose not to. The vague order is too open to interpretation, making it very difficult to enforce. The Supreme Court upheld her order to facilitate Mr. Garcia's return, but also instructed the judge to clarify what exactly she meant by facilitate. This is a positive development because now the original judge has the opportunity to be very specific about what needs to be done. The government will then likely appeal that clarification, sending it back to the Supreme Court. Then, they can offer a ruling that should resolve this matter conclusively. The Supreme Court does not address issues outside the subject matter being considered. They will not say, "You should have included this and that in your order, but since you did not, we will specify it for you." That is not their practice. Therefore, once the lower court order is amended and everything is hopefully clear, it will return to the Supreme Court, allowing them to take substantial action. So, I do not think the Supreme Court ruling was exceptional. I believe it was the best outcome possible, given the functioning of the court system and the poorly worded order from the lower court. What will truly matter and have a significant impact is how they rule once the clarified lower court order is sent back to them. The court will either decide that the government does not need to work to achieve Mr. Garcia's return to the United States, or they will rule that they must take specific, substantive action to bring him back. If they make the latter ruling, that will lead to the anticipated confrontation between the Supreme Court and the previous administration. Will the former president comply with the law, or will he disregard the Supreme Court? This situation is likely to become very clear when it occurs, and we will all witness it. If he disobeys the ruling in this case, it sets a precedent for ignoring all future rulings, threatening the very existence of the United States as a functioning republic. Story 28. It was 9-0 against the Trump administration. Trump and his administration chose not to adhere to the ruling. The Republican far-right, sitting at home, are the MAGA supporters who barely pay attention to even Fox News, only coming away with "we won and take that, liberals." Story 29. ChatGPT is effective for questions like this. Republican perspective. Republicans argue that the Supreme Court's decision affirms the executive branch's authority over immigration and foreign policy. They emphasize that the court did not mandate the physical return of SCOTUS Abrego Garcia but rather instructed the government to facilitate his release from custody in El Salvador and ensure his case is handled as if he had not been improperly deported. From this viewpoint, the term facilitate is interpreted as allowing the administration to take reasonable steps without being compelled to bring Garcia back to the United States. This interpretation supports the notion that the judiciary recognizes the limits of its power in directing executive actions, especially in matters involving foreign governments. Furthermore, Republicans highlight concerns about national security, noting that the administration has alleged Garcia's affiliation with MS-13, a designated foreign terrorist organization. They argue that the executive branch must have discretion in handling cases involving individuals who may pose a threat to public safety. In summary, Republicans view the ruling as a reinforcement of executive authority and a cautious approach to immigration enforcement, aligning with their broader policy goals. Democratic perspective. Democrats interpret the Supreme Court's decision as a clear affirmation of due process rights and a check on executive overreach. They point out that Garcia had been granted withholding of removal status in 2019, legally allowing him to live and work in the United States, and that his deportation violated this protection. The court's directive to facilitate Garcia's release and ensure his case is treated as if the unlawful deportation had not occurred is seen by Democrats as an acknowledgement of the government's error and a commitment to rectify it. They argue that this sets a precedent for upholding the rights of individuals against unlawful government actions. Democrats also express concern over the administration's reluctance to act on the court's directive, viewing it as a disregard for judicial authority and the rule of law. They emphasize the importance of compliance with court orders to maintain the integrity of the legal system. In essence, Democrats see the ruling as a victory for constitutional protections and a necessary intervention to prevent potential abuses of power by the executive branch. Both parties thus claim the ruling supports their positions. Republicans focus on executive discretion and national security, while Democrats emphasize due process and judicial oversight. Story 30. Because while the Supreme Court of the United States said, "Don't do it again," and facilitate his return, they also ruled that the lower courts didn't have jurisdiction to stop Trump from doing it, and facilitate only means they have to ask El Salvador for help. As we have seen, El Salvador declined, and the Trump administration shrugged and said, "Oh well, we tried." So Republicans won on their fundamental argument of jurisdiction, and the specific choice of wording means they are not forced to make significant efforts to get him back. Democrats won in that Trump was told to stop, as it is detrimental. Story 31. It seems that reading comprehension is lacking in the White House and among those supporting their actions. Story 32. News and politics have finally collided and become partners. In the past, news organizations traditionally maintained some level of checks and balances. Today, U.S. media, specifically Fox News, is more akin to state-sponsored propaganda. Republicans often say whatever they want, knowing the message will be passed on to their constituents. Fox News is not really a news organization. It is entertainment, so they are not held to any standard. Even Jon Stewart on The Daily Show was adamant about addressing retractions. It is not a great time in the U.S. People are voting against their best interests, and the oligarchs are unofficially running the show because U.S. citizens are grossly misled, uninformed, and undereducated. Story 33. Because the ruling was multifaceted and ambiguous. It requires the President of the United States to facilitate Garcia's return. Democrats say, facilitate means bring him back immediately. Republicans say they win because they interpret that as yielding foreign policy to the executive branch. What foreign policy means in this scenario is also unclear. In reality, the Supreme Court seems to have been purposely vague and ordered the lower court to define her order to effectuate the return of Garcia. Meanwhile, nobody knows where he is or if he is alive, and we continue to sell people to a foreign nation. Story 34. It doesn't matter the outcome of any situation. Trump always claims it was in his favor. Just like Steve Bannon said, he practices the belief that if you repeat the same lie multiple times, people will believe it. And he was right. Story 35. This question seems to come from someone who should simply abstain from voting altogether since they cannot determine what is happening. Story 36. Fascism requires total control over information, and one of the fundamental tools used to achieve this is lying about anything unfavorable. Story 37. Trump is making power statements, a variety of lies that are brazen in their denial of reality. He is the schoolyard bully who has stolen your hat, put it on his head, and walks around claiming it is his and always has been. He is daring you to contradict him, backed up by his friends or his size or whatever makes him think he can bully people. This is the nature of reality in a dictatorship. Most Americans still think Trump is a wannabe dictator or trying to play king. This rejection of the reality of the Supreme Court decision is dictatorial. Last term, Trump was a wannabe. This term, Trump is a dictator. Story 38. I came to the conclusion that the Supreme Court ruling suggesting they should facilitate the return, rather than demanding it, is perceived as a win. It's vague and avoidable enough in a courtroom that there is no concern about consequences, allowing them to return to business. The issue lies not in what the Supreme Court stated they have to do, but in what they did not state they have to do. That's their so-called win. Story 39. So, remember that time when you and your sibling both claimed victory after a family board game while everyone was scratching their heads in confusion? That's pretty much what's happening with the Abrego Garcia Supreme Court ruling. Each party interprets the ruling in a way that aligns with their views. Democrats focus on the parts of the ruling that affirm their principles, and Republicans do the same. It's like both are looking at a cloud. One sees a horse and the other sees a spaceship, based on their preferences. This isn't just an American phenomenon. It happens worldwide. It's a mix of political language and the human ability to interpret situations in our favor. And who doesn't like winning, right? Even if it's just in our heads. Story 40. Let's say Russia has a Supreme Court and that court rules that Putin, in this science fiction hypothetical, he is actually a democratically elected president and not a maniac and a tyrant, needs to facilitate the return of a United States citizen to Russia. The United States does not want to let the person go. Nothing would happen. The United States would refuse. The only solution would be negotiation. In the end, We are talking about a citizen of the country where Garcia is located. The Supreme Court has no jurisdiction in foreign countries. That said, the president should absolutely explore every diplomatic option to bring the individual back, but he cannot force it. Story 41. I think if Trump withheld the payment to El Salvador of $6 million, El Salvador would release any or all of the prisoners. Without the funding and promises of additional funds, El Salvador would not be involved at all. Story 42. Both parties may believe the 9-0 ruling is in their favor because they interpret the decision as supporting their values or priorities. Story 43. Because the order is to facilitate his return, not to return him. Facilitate means to enable it to happen, not to do it. The entire situation of Bukele coming to the United States and refusing to return him is based on that. Republicans are playing semantics and disregarding the clear intention of the order, which is to get him back. However, Trump's ability to summon Bukele to the United States for the meeting and conspire with him to build more prisons for Trump's use contradicts the notion that Trump cannot bring the man back to the United States. Story 44. The Supreme Court of the United States decision ruled that the original lower court order requiring the executive branch to ensure the return of Abrego Garcia went beyond its authority. Their ruling stated that the executive branch should instead facilitate his return. To ensure something means to make it happen and to take measures to prevent its failure. To facilitate means to make the action easier to happen, like removing barriers to success. Translation. If Abrego Garcia can make his way out of El Salvador and to the United States, this administration will not prevent him, nor will they encourage another country to assist him. They will deport him elsewhere if he is successful in returning on his own. This meets the requirement of the order as it stands now. Perhaps we will get more details in the future. Story 45. The answers here are highly partisan in favor of the Democrats. Democratic position. They ordered the administration to facilitate his return home and asserted that due process is required. Republicans. They dismissed the use of the Alien Enemies Act and chose the term facilitate rather than effectuate. This issue can be spun to support both sides. Story 46. The Republicans do not see it as their advantage. They are being dishonest. The ruling was completely clear. It properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. There is no way they are misinterpreting the ruling. They are falsely using the fact that the deadline passed and that the Supreme Court must rule on the matter first. Consider it this way. If the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, then the Department of Justice would not have reason to file a second appeal against the district court order, which they did yesterday. As of today, they are actively attempting to find a legal means to challenge the ruling. Story 47. One piece I observed was that the initial ruling was to facilitate and effectuate the return, meaning to make it happen. The Supreme Court ruling was just facilitate, stating that you cannot order the executive branch to effectuate, because if it were binding, then El Salvador could refuse to comply and use it as leverage to negotiate or force the United States to try to return him by force. The Trump administration can view this as a win because facilitate is vague, allowing them to claim they are facilitating. They brought the president here and informed Immigration and Customs Enforcement that they would expedite the review of any approvals. There is a lot of completely ineffective facilitation they can provide that accomplishes nothing. The Supreme Court is not holding him to anything, so he is getting away with it. Story 48. Chief Justice Roberts knows their power is diminishing, and the White House is mistaken. He sought a unanimous judgment to demonstrate that it is not. However, to achieve this, he had to use vague wording so that the more extreme justices would endorse it. This means that while the intention of the ruling aligns more with what the Democrats are arguing, it still leaves enough room for those in the MAGA movement to claim some form of victory. Story 49. Media misinformation machine doing its thing. You won. Nothing to be angry about here. Go back to work and remember to pay your taxes. Story 50. The whole situation reminds me of that viral dress debate from years ago. Some people swore it was blue and black, while others insisted it was white and gold. Same image, different perceptions. This illustrates how our brains can interpret identical information in completely different ways depending on our starting point. Story 51, Weak Conviction. It seems they decided on precedence. I would prefer Thurgood Marshall to ensure there is at least someone who stands for the people. Story 52. They say he is MS-13, but there is no evidence of that, just a police report from someone thinking he might be, which is not evidence. The facts are that he was in the United States legally, was protected by a United States judge's decision from being extradited to El Salvador, and has never been convicted of a crime in the United States or any other country. He has a United States citizen spouse and child. But the Trump administration made a mistake and sent an innocent man to a death sentence without due process, which is obscenely criminal. Story 53. Both sides received something they wanted. Republicans obtained the Supreme Court ruling that the executive branch only has to effectuate his return, which means to try your best, but do not worry if you cannot. Democrats, on the other hand, at least have to attempt to get him back and cannot deport anyone else without their day in court. Story 54. Supporters of former President Trump often believe everything they are told. They might even harm themselves in a silly way, and if Trump claimed it was acceptable, they would likely do it again. Story 55. The ruling is somewhat ambiguous because the initial section indicates that the district court needs to provide more specificity about its order, while also acknowledging that foreign policy decisions are the responsibility of the executive branch. This could be interpreted as a victory for conservatives. However, the remainder of the ruling contains some judges agreeing with the district court's decision, which may be seen as a victory for liberals. Why is the decision unanimous? The request was to void the order requiring the individual's return by April 7th. Since that date has passed, all judges concur that the motion is partially granted. The district court's deadline is dismissed, but the overall ruling remains intact. This is my interpretation based on reading the ruling. Consists of only 4 pages. Story 56. We are living through a Republican administration that is objectively the most recklessly dishonest in history, with a documented history of spinning and lying about nearly everything. People are still going out of their way to give Republicans the benefit of the doubt. What is wrong with people? The Trump administration is obviously lying. It's the most reasonable conclusion. They are doing something horribly wrong, illegal, immoral, and unpopular, yet somehow if they just deny it and lie, people will accept it. Are you really this unaware? Story 57. Like anything, you can shape the topic to fit your narrative. The statement was worded purposefully vague because it is catering to this administration, and that is coming from a former Trump supporter. Story 58. Generally, the most difficult thing to get Democrats to do is read source documents, watch actual videos, and review definitions. Many of them avoid exposure to the truth and factual information, favoring distorted media interpretations instead. As a result, they perpetuate hoaxes, spread misinformation, and unwittingly support the numerous kleptocratic, oligarchic billionaires who control the Democratic Party. Additionally, Republicans are often criticized for their choices. Story 59. Their ruling is confusing. It suggests that while the district court is correct in stating that they should bring him back, the unclear wording from the lower court prevents them from ruling in his favor. In response to your question, Democrats claim they won because they succeeded in the spirit of the argument, while Republicans feel they won because the ruling does not require them to actually bring him home. Regardless, I believe we will see another challenge with clarified wording. Relevant quotes from the ruling. On Friday, April 4th, the United States District Court for the District of Maryland entered an order directing the government to facilitate and effectuate the return of Abrego Garcia to the United States by no later than 11:59 p.m. on Monday, April 7th. The application is granted in part and denied in part, subject to the direction of this order. Due to the administrative stay issued by the Chief Justice, the deadline imposed by the District Court has now passed. To that extent, the government's emergency application is effectively granted in part, and the deadline in the challenged order is no longer effective. The rest of the District Court's order remains in effect but requires clarification on remand. The order properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. The intended scope of the term effectuate in the district court's order is, however, unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. The district court should clarify its directive, with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. For its part, the government should be prepared to share what it can concerning the steps it has taken and the prospect of further steps. The order entered by the Chief Justice is vacated. Story 60. Because it is all a big show, neither side cares about anything other than retaining power and financial gain. Story 61. What is it with Americans interacting with the internet as if everyone online is American? Story 62. No Republican voters have any idea who Garcia is, that there was ever a ruling, or that anything happened at all. Most of them are more invested in whether Elvis is still alive. Story 63. Because one side reads the rulings and listens to the statements made by the justices, while the other trusts whatever their politicians and media tell them. Let me guess which side you are on. Story 64. Both outcomes were technically achieved. On the liberal side, the ruling states that Trump must facilitate the return. On the conservative side, the trial was held in the wrong district, and the president has the authority to deport. Story 65. Reading through the comments is amusing because it resembles watching someone figure out what happened by writing it down. Essentially, it was ruled 9-0 in favor of the Republic. Story 66. The actual Supreme Court ruling states, the district court should clarify its directive, with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. Republicans consider this a victory for Trump's executive branch because it instructs the district court to clarify its orders and returns judicial power to conduct foreign affairs back to Trump's executive branch. Democrats are focusing on the part of the ruling that orders the government to follow due process, which is why they see it as a win. In fact, the court is not favoring either Republicans or Democrats. It is asserting that people deserve due process and that the executive branch conducts foreign affairs. Before downvoting, please read the actual ruling and then review the prompt. There is confusion on this platform. I have provided the actual answer. Let's see how this community responds to objective truth and reality. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.